rights. Our collective responsibility is to ensure that
our collector that future generations inherit better than the one we found.
A Harvard law titan sneered at Jasmine Crockett's degree, but within minutes she flipped the script so hard that even legal legends were stunned. It began as a clash that wasn't supposed to matter. One voice, polished by decades of prestige, steeped in ivory towers, wielding a roue sommet that stretched from Harvard's lecture halls to televised courtrooms. Against him stood Jasmine Crockett, a woman forged not in the safe corridors of elite academia, but in the charged chaos of real courtrooms, where the stakes weren't theoretical arguments but human freedom itself. The stage felt uneven, tilted by history itself. Dershowitz carried the weight of Goliath, towering credentials, name recognition, and the arrogance of assumed superiority. Crockett carried only her lived truth, the long nights of public defense, the battles for those forgotten by society, the determination etched into every word. And then it happened. With cameras rolling and an audience listening in, the Titan made his move, a condescending smile, a dismissive remark that cut not at policy or principle, but at identity itself, her law degree, as if the institution on her diploma determined her worth, as if years of sweat, grind, and courtroom grit could be diminished by a single sneer. The insult landed like a slap, not just to Crockett, but to everyone who had ever felt their hard work brushed aside by someone born into a higher rung. For a moment, the air thickened with the weight of arrogance, the kind of arrogance that assumes hierarchy is destiny. But Crockett did not flinch, she did not crumble. Instead, she locked her gaze, steady and unshaken, and the balance of power began to shift. What happens, the audience silently wondered, when Ivy League elitism collides with unapologetic authenticity? Live, unfiltered, on air. The answer was coming, and it would not be gentle. This was no longer a polite debate or academic sparring. It was a test of dignity itself, a battle between the illusion of prestige and the unshakable truth of lived experience. And by the time the moment reached its peak, Dershowitz would find himself cornered, not Crockett. For generations, the world of law has been ruled by hierarchy. At the top of the pyramid sit the Ivy League titans, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, institutions where prestige is currency and pedigree can silence a room before a single argument is spoken. Within those halls, future judges, senators, and celebrity lawyers are groomed to believe their degrees are more than paper, they are crowns. And those crowns are worn proudly, sometimes arrogantly, in every courtroom and every televised debate. But outside the ivory towers lies another world, one where lawyers grind out 12-hour days in underfunded courtrooms, defending clients who can barely afford representation, battling a system designed to crush them. These lawyers are not profiled on magazine covers. They do not give guest lectures on campus lawns. They fight in the shadows, overlooked, underpaid, underestimated. Yet in those shadows, a different kind of authority is forged, one rooted in reality, not reputation. Dershowitz has always embodied the first world, a celebrated legal scholar. He has argued before the Supreme Court, advised presidents, and defended the infamous. His reputation precedes him everywhere he goes. To his admirers, he is a genius of constitutional law. To his critics, a man addicted to the spotlight. He thrives on being the smartest voice in the room, the arbiter of what counts as legitimate legal thought. And yet, behind that brilliance lingers a flawed and ego so large it occasionally blinds him to the strength of those who do not carry his brand of prestige. Enter Jasmine Crockett. She does not come draped in ivy or cloaked in celebrity. She steps onto the stage as something rawer, sharper, more unfiltered. A Texas-born fighter who built her career not through elite connections, but through relentless courtroom battles on behalf of people the system would rather forget. She is blunt, unapologetic, and unwilling to bend to etiquette when dignity is on the line. And for that, she has become both a lightning rod for criticism and a voice that resonates far beyond political boundaries. The contrast could not be sharper. On one side, the polished professor whose life has been a masterclass in wielding status. On the other hand, the rising congresswoman who carved her authority in sweat, sacrifice, and the refusal to stay silent. Together, they represent two Americas, one of inherited crowns, the other of earned scars. And in politics, just as in law, reputation is everything. A single moment can shape a narrative for years, even decades. An insult left unanswered can harden into a permanent stain. A clapback delivered with precision can echo across social media, transforming reputations overnight. In a profession where credibility is the lifeblood, humiliation is fatal. That is what made this moment so combustible. Dershowitz stepped into the arena assuming the old rules would apply. Prestige silences authenticity. Hierarchy defeats hustle. Ivy League towers overshadow local grit. But Crockett had no intention of bowing to that script. She had played too many high-stakes games in real courtrooms to be intimidated by televised condescension. The stage was set for a collision. The cameras would catch not just an argument, but a generational reckoning: old guard versus new voices, pedigree versus lived truth. What began as a panel discussion would morph into something else entirely. A duel of legitimacy in front of a nation eager to see who flinches first. And as the lights burned hot and microphones hummed live, the countdown to confrontation began. Alan Dershowitz has lived most of his life under the bright glare of credibility. A celebrated trial lawyer, a fixture in media circles, and a longtime Harvard professor, his résumé reads like a catalog of legal triumph. He argued constitutional questions before the Supreme Court, defended clients whose names defined headlines, and became the voice networks turned to when law collided with scandal. In every arena, his reputation carried the weight of authority. But prestige comes with temptation. Dershowitz never merely debated. He dominated. His sharp intellect was matched by a sharper tongue, one that often cut deeper than the argument required. He thrived on hierarchy, on reminding others of the distance between his Ivy League throne and their lesser perches. For some, his confidence was brilliance; for others, it reeked of condescension. And beneath the polished veneer, shadows lingered. His name, once untouchable, has been drawn into controversy more than once, his credibility questioned not for lack of intelligence, but for his willingness to stand where others would not. Admirers called it courage. Critics called it arrogance cloaked as principle. In each storm, his brilliance seemed to survive, but always undercut, always with a whisper that the man who prized hierarchy too much might one day misjudge the ground beneath his feet. That flaw would soon matter, because arrogance, no matter how gilded, eventually meets resistance. And when it does, titles and credentials are no shield. They become heavy armor that slows the wielder down. Dershowitz had spent a lifetime winning by leaning on prestige. What he did not know, not yet, was that he was about to collide with someone who didn't fear it at all. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in marble lecture halls or ivy-covered corridors. It begins in courtrooms where the paint chipped off the walls, where her clients waited in shackles, and where justice was often more theory than practice. As a public defender, she stood beside those who could not afford representation, fighting battles no television crew ever cared to cover. There, she learned the law not as an academic exercise, but as a lifeline, and she carried those lessons like armor. Her path to politics was no smoother. When she entered the Texas legislature, critics underestimated her from the start. They called her too blunt, too raw, too unwilling to play the game of deference. Her background was dissected, her degree questioned, her very appearance picked apart. The boldness of her speech, the texture of her hair, even the vibrancy of her clothing became targets for those desperate to box her in. But every attempt to diminish her only sharpened her resolve. Crockett understood what it meant to carry legitimacy that others could not see until it was forced into the spotlight. She had to outwork, outargue, and outlast colleagues who had been granted automatic respect by pedigree alone. And in that grind, she built something far stronger than inherited prestige. She built credibility forged in fire. For audiences watching her rise, the alignment is immediate. She is the voice for those dismissed by condescension, the embodiment of resilience against elitism's sneer. And that is what makes the next turn inevitable. Because when arrogance finally aims its barbs at her, Crockett will not shrink. She will strike, and the strike will land harder because of everything she has endured to stand there. The cameras were live, the microphones hot, the stage framed as a polite discussion on law and politics. But beneath the smiles and handshakes, the tension was already coiling. The kind of tension that builds when two worldviews share the same air but cannot coexist. Alan Dershowitz leaned forward first, his voice calm, measured, carrying the confidence of decades on national television. He framed his point in layers of history, quoting precedent and sprinkling in references to names and cases that only seasoned lawyers could casually invoke. His delivery was smooth, practiced, the performance of a man accustomed to commanding attention. And then, with that condescending smile that audiences had come to recognize, he slipped in the blade. "Well, Congresswoman," he said, "your degree doesn't carry quite the same weight in the legal world. We have to be honest about that." The words hung in the air like a slap, a backhanded dismissal dressed in the veneer of civility. For a split second, the audience felt the sting, not just for Crockett, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, that their hard work could never measure up against pedigree. Crockett didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, her voice measured, even respectful. She countered with an appeal to substance, that the practice of law is not about the name on the diploma but the lives defended, the communities served, the clients who walk free because someone stood for them. It was a calm rebuke, a reminder that justice isn't theory, it's reality. But Dershowitz was not done. He doubled down, his tone tightening, his words dripping with the kind of authority only decades of prestige can produce. There's a difference between real legal scholarship, he pressed, and, well, the kind of practice you're describing. One is about shaping the law itself. The other is application at best. Gaslighting, live on air. His framing suggested her world was lesser, her work diminished, her victories mere scraps compared to his grand battles in marble halls. It was hierarchy, laid bare, as if his experience existed on a plane too high for her to even touch. The panel grew tense. Other guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to interject. The moderators let the silence linger, cameras capturing every flicker of expression. And viewers at home, law students, professionals, ordinary citizens, felt the imbalance. They knew what was happening. The old guard was pulling rank, using prestige as a weapon, dismissing lived reality as if it were a footnote. Still, Crockett held her ground. She leaned into her chair, folded her hands, and spoke with precision. She reminded him that law is not built by titles, but tested in the crucible of human struggle. She spoke of defending people who couldn't afford lawyers, of cases where the law wasn't abstract but life and death. Her words carried weight not from theory, but from blood and bone. Yet Dershowitz pressed harder, refusing to give her credit, circling back again to hierarchy. You see, in elite circles, the courts listen differently. The scholarship influences rulings. That's the difference between a Harvard-trained legal mind and, well, with all due respect, your background. The knife twisted. He wasn't debating anymore. He was dismissing. His tone suggested finality, as if his crown granted him the last word. And still Crockett did not erupt. She stayed steady, every rebuttal a careful note, every phrase a refusal to let the sting define her. But something in her eyes shifted. Behind the calm, behind the composure, a fire was starting to burn. Because there comes a point in every fight when defense is not enough. When silence or politeness only fuels the arrogance of the other side. The audience could feel it. The moment approaching when patience would give way to precision, when restraint would turn to retaliation. The cameras caught it, that subtle pause, the breath before the storm, and that's when Crockett stopped playing defense. For a long moment, the silence after Dershowitz's dismissal seemed to stretch endlessly. The audience leaned in, waiting to see whether Jasmine Crockett would take the insult in stride, or whether she would let the sting ignite something sharper. Then she leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, her expression calm but her tone edged with steel. "With all due respect, Alan," she said, her voice carrying the deliberate weight of restraint, "defending billionaires from tax fraud isn't the same as defending people who can't afford a lawyer." The panel froze. A single sentence, but it cracked the air like thunder. Even the moderator blinked, caught off guard by the precision of the strike. In that instant, the rhythm shifted. What had been a lecture delivered from the mountaintop suddenly became a duel fought on even ground. And for the first time that night, Alan Dershowitz looked unsettled. Crockett didn't pause. She pressed forward, weaving lived experience into every line. She spoke of walking into overcrowded courtrooms where defendants were treated like numbers, not names. She described mothers begging for public defenders to save their sons, fathers who had worked their entire lives only to see their futures decided by a system stacked against them. That, she said firmly, is the law as most Americans live it. Not in journals, not in ivory towers, but in human lives. The chat feed lit up. Viewers hammered reactions into their keyboards. "She's cooking him! That's the truth right there!" Finally, someone telling Dershowitz to his face. Social media began to buzz, clips clipped live from the broadcast spreading like sparks catching dry grass. Dershowitz tried to recover. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and pivoted to scholarship. He spoke of shaping doctrine, of influencing generations, of writing legal arguments that found their way into Supreme Court opinions. But every word felt heavier now, labored, as if he were trying to reassert a crown that had already slipped. Crockett let him speak, and then, with surgical precision, she cut again. "It's interesting you mention influence, Alan, because in my experience, real influence isn't measured in citations. It's measured in lives changed. You can write all the theories you want, but when you've watched a judge release a teenager because you fought tooth and nail, that's influence too. Influence they'll remember for the rest of their life." Gasps rippled across the panel. One of the commentators smiled involuntarily, caught between shock and admiration. The rhythm was undeniable. Every time Dershowitz tried to climb back onto his throne, Crockett knocked the pedestal out from under him. Sarcasm began to color her edges. subtle at first but devastating. "I guess we just see the law differently," she said, voice laced with irony. "For some it's about debating hypotheticals. For me, it's about stopping someone from losing their home or spending decades behind bars for a mistake. Maybe that's just too practical for Harvard." Laughter erupted from parts of the studio audience. Online, the clip became instant meme material. Tweets appeared in real time. "Too practical for Harvard," DEA'd. The more Crockett leaned into authenticity, the more the gap between them widened. Dershowitz grew visibly frustrated. He raised his voice, leaning forward, trying to re-establish dominance. He accused her of oversimplifying, of equating courtroom anecdotes with legal scholarship. But the more he spoke, the more he sounded defensive, cornered. The audience could sense it. The professor, who had entered so sure of his superiority, was now scrambling to keep pace with a congresswoman who refused to bow. Crockett countered each pivot with grounded reality. When he invoked Supreme Court citations, she brought up overcrowded prisons. When he cited elite conferences, she invoked families bankrupted by legal fees. When he boasted about teaching the next generation of scholars, she reminded him that some students never even make it to law school because the system chews them up before they get there. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was exposure. With each turn, Crockett peeled back the layers of elitism, showing how distant Dershowitz's world was from the one most Americans lived in. The contrast was brutal. His brilliance was not in question, but his detachment was impossible to ignore. The camera caught it all: the tightening of his jaw, the restless tapping of his fingers, the subtle stammer as he searched for footing, and in stark relief, Crockett's composure steady, sharp, unflinching. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. The power was already hers. By the halfway point of the exchange, the dynamic had fully inverted. Dershowitz no longer looked like the professor lecturing a junior colleague. He looked like a man trying to escape quicksand, each word dragging him further down. And Crockett, she looked like the embodiment of every outsider who had been told they didn't belong, finally turning the tables. The audience knew they were witnessing more than an argument. They were watching a cultural reckoning, the collapse of elitism's assumed superiority before the unshakable force of authenticity. Every rebuttal from Crockett wasn't just a counterpoint. It was a revelation, an unmasking of how prestige can blind itself to truth. And yet, Crockett had not delivered her finishing blow. She was pacing herself, building momentum, letting the audience feel the shift with each turn of the knife. Social media was already ablaze, hashtags trending, clips circulating, but the true viral moment, the one-liner that would etch this exchange into history, had not yet been spoken. The tension coiled tighter. Every viewer could sense it. Something bigger was coming. Because Crockett wasn't finished, she was just getting started. The exchange had already shifted, but no one expected the moment that came next. Dershowitz, red in the face, leaned forward with the faint desperation of a man accustomed to always having the final word. "Congresswoman," he said, voice clipped, "there is a difference between practicing law and understanding it. You should recognize the limits of your, let's call it, training." It was condescension sharpened to a blade. The panel braced for impact. Viewers at home sucked in air, the kind of collective gasp that precedes a defining clash. And then Crockett struck. "Alan," she said, her tone calm but cutting, "I don't need a Harvard stamp to validate my work. Because while you were teaching theory to students who can afford tuition, I was standing beside clients who couldn't afford freedom. And I'd argue that's a law degree that carries more weight than any paper hanging in your office." Silence detonated across the set. Absolute, ringing silence. Even the moderator froze, lips parted as though to speak, but unable to summon words. Panelists exchanged glances, some stunned, others smiling at the audacity of it. The camera lingered on Dershowitz, who opened his mouth to reply but closed it again, the words refusing to come. It was over. Everyone knew it. The reaction outside the studio was instant and volcanic. On Twitter, the clip exploded across timelines. "That's a law degree that carries more weight," became the phrase of the night, repeated, remixed, and emblazoned on memes before the broadcast had even ended. Law students typed it out like scripture, some calling it the most honest summation of the gap between elitism and lived justice they had ever heard. Hashtags surged, "Faint Crockett Clapback, more weight for Harvard vs. reality." In living rooms across the country, people replayed the clip again and again, marveling not just at the sharpness of the words but at the moral clarity behind them. It was whiplash in real time, the arrogance of pedigree crumbling into the awe of authenticity. The professor who had entered the room untouchable now sat diminished, while the congresswoman, once been underestimated, stood ascendant. Even legal commentators, some who had built careers admiring Dershowitz, conceded the point. On a rival network, one admitted almost begrudgingly, "She's right. What Crockett just said will echo in classrooms and courtrooms for years. This wasn't about prestige. This was about purpose." Back in the studio, Dershowitz finally attempted to recover, forcing a chuckle that landed flat. "Well," he said, spreading his hands with a strained grin, "I suppose I'll have to add defending billionaires to my resume." The joke fell into the void unclaimed, awkward in the shadow of what had just transpired. No one laughed, because the moment had already been immortalized. The clapback belonged to Crockett now, carved into the memory of everyone watching. It was the kind of moment that cannot be undone, cannot be explained away, cannot be softened with humor. A titan of prestige had sneered and been silenced, and as the broadcast cut to commercial, the buzz of social media was already rewriting the narrative. Dershowitz wasn't the headline anymore. Jasmine Crockett was. The commercial break ended, the panel reassembled, but the atmosphere had shifted into something electric, almost reverent. Jasmine Crockett did not beam or bask in what she had just delivered. She did not lean back with smugness or spike the football in celebration. Instead, she sat poised, collected, a stillness radiating the confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. Across the table, Alan Dershowitz looked diminished, a man who had misjudged the battlefield and found himself cornered not by anger but by clarity. For decades, he had thrived on provocation, on towering above challengers with prestige and intellect. Yet now he sat quietly, the cautionary tale of hubris, proof that arrogance, when unchecked, eventually meets its match. The audience watching didn't just see a spat about credentials. They saw something deeper, something more elemental. This was not about where a lawyer earned their degree. It was about what authority really means. Is it a certificate gilded with ivy, or is it the courage to stand shoulder to shoulder with people who have nothing? Is it theoretical mastery, or is it the lived reality of defense, advocacy, and service? Crockett's calm presence answered those questions without fanfare. In that moment, her silence spoke louder than any follow-up line ever could. She represented the weight of authenticity, an authority not granted by elite gatekeepers but earned through grit and lived struggle, and the contrast was unforgettable. Dershowitz, once celebrated as a genius of the courtroom, now appeared like an echo of a different era, brilliant, yes, but brittle, powerful, but untethered from the lives of the very people law is meant to protect. His attempt to reduce another's worth to the ranking of a school had collapsed in on itself, leaving only a reminder of how fragile prestige becomes when measured against substance. The reflection rippled outward. Law students whispered to each other, "Maybe it's not about chasing Harvard after all." Community organizers nodded, seeing themselves affirmed in the spotlight. Even casual viewers, people who had never cracked open a casebook, understood the parable, because this wasn't just a legal skirmish. It was a moral fable played out in real time. The lesson was clear, carved into the moment like scripture: arrogance collapses, authenticity resonates. And Crockett had embodied that lesson not by shouting, not by gloating, but by remaining grounded, unshaken, and unbothered in the aftermath. As the broadcast wound down, the camera lingered for a final wide shot. Two figures sat at opposite ends of the table, one restless, the other serene, one desperate to reclaim ground, the other content, knowing the ground had already shifted beneath them. The fight had never truly been about law school rankings. It had always been about legitimacy, about who speaks with authority in a world where prestige can no longer hide from lived truth. And in that contest, Jasmine Crockett had shown the nation exactly where real weight lies. He insulted her degree, but her response didn't just defend herself, it redefined the debate. What began as a sneer about pedigree transformed into a cultural turning point, one where the balance of authority shifted from paper prestige to lived authenticity. The proof is written everywhere in the viral clips replayed millions of times, in the Twitter threads labeling it masterclass in composure, in the YouTube comments declaring she bodied him without breaking a sweat. Law students cite her words in classrooms. Community voices echo them at rallies, and even critics admit Jasmine Crockett turned a condescending jab into a generational statement. But here's the question for you. If you were watching that exchange live, whose side would you have been on? Would you have sided with the ivory tower, or with the fire of lived courage staring it down? Drop your take below. Was this the coldest clapback of the year? And if you believe dignity will always crush arrogance, make sure you subscribe. Because these aren't just stories. They're lessons. They're proof that authenticity still has the power to humble giants. And remember this, if one viral exchange can humble a legend, imagine what happens when the next courtroom queen takes the mic.